everyone. Welcome to GlideFast On Air. I'm Lauren Jankowski, the marketing manager here at GlideFast, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, Leveraging ServiceNow's Software Asset Management Professional to Control IT Spend and Compliance. Today's presenters will be Shane Cooper, a solutions consultant from GlideFast, Will Young, a senior architect from GlideFast, and Sarah Butler, a systems analyst from ONEOK. Before we get started, I'd like to give you some background information on GlideFast. GlideFast Consulting is a consulting firm that is dedicated exclusively to ServiceNow. As an Elite ServiceNow Partner, our expert team of developers and architects have worked on both sides of the table, on the customer side and the consulting side. Our company was founded by ServiceNow architects, and we're proud to have a team of over 100 experienced consultants, an average CSAT score of a 9.6, and many accolades as you can see here. We have multiple International Association of IT Asset Manager certifications, including Certified Software Asset Manager and Certified Asset Management Professional. I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout today's session, so please send in any questions as they arise, and we'll do our best to answer them for you. As another perk of attending today's webinar, we'll be giving away a $50 Visa gift card at the end. We'll be announcing it at the end, so make sure you stay on for the entire webinar. Now, I'd like to hand things over to Shane to dive in.
Thanks, Lauren. So today we're going to cover software asset management, just to do an introduction into it for those of you who are not familiar with it. I'm going to go into detail on SAM Pro, and then we'll get into what we did for ONEOK, some of the accomplishments and the final solution, and then ONEOK's lessons learned, and then SAM Pro's never-ending story. And we'll explain that when we get there. So just to give you a little introduction on software asset management. So most of the time people assume software asset management just involves the application or the technology for scanning software installed in an organization. But in reality, it's both that and a set of business practices for an organization that supports the use of the software. So these practices are used for things like customer satisfaction, cost effectiveness, risk reduction, strategic planning, and decision support. Software asset management is quickly becoming a requirement for many organizations, both big and small. And the software asset manager can utilize this to track licensing consumed. They can compare it to the rights purchased, as well as track and automate allocations for those licenses. Automation and self-service combined with proper business practices can streamline this whole process, and nothing does that better than SAM Pro. So I want to read this. There are studies done by Gartner that state that most organizations go through at least 3 or more software audits a year. And if you've been involved in an audit like that, you understand the pain points. A lot of that comes from data that is not really concise or consolidated, and it makes it difficult for gathering this information for the audits. ServiceNow and SAM Pro does a great job of putting everything into a nice, neat location. And I kind of want to go over some of the main functionality behind SAM Pro. The SAM Pro allows you to normalize software assets. After you get your discovery source set up, it's capable of normalizing the data together. And what that means is it can take all of your individual names brought in from your discovery source and match them with publishers and products. And this makes the data more readable, easier to account for, and it also allows you to group everything together for licensing consumption later on. ServiceNow provides content packs to go along with this to make normalization a lot easier. ServiceNow also offers you to leverage publisher packs. So it's not uncommon for different publishers to use different licensing models. Just think of Adobe or Citrix or Microsoft for that matter. It can make it really difficult for tracking license usage whenever you have all of these different licensing types. In addition to the content packs, these publisher packs make it a lot easier to group these different licenses together. And it's not more apparent than whenever you view the publisher dashboard. You can actually see all of these licensing organized in the way that they should be to make it easier to view. And so this also allows you to take action on your license position. So the license workbench is a great place to view license compliance. You can view your different publishers of all of the software that you have installed. You can dig down into the publishers, and then you can see your software models and your products, and you can see your compliance, your unallocated uses, allocated uses, installations. It's a great place to be able to narrow down what is compliant and what isn't as far as your license installation. Another feature that is very widely used is the ability to import your organization's entitlement data. So whether you had a previous software asset management application, or if you were tracking this via spreadsheets, there's a template that ServiceNow offers that allows you to put all of your data into that template and then import all of that data bulk into SAM Pro. The import will create software entitlements and software models at the same time as the import. So having all of that data in the same place allows you to really utilize the functionality to detect software spend. And after importing all of this data in there, you can import your financial transaction data. And this allows you to track, analyze, and optimize software spending. So this function singles out expenditures that are specifically software purchases. And so you can narrow down all the expenses based around a single publisher or product. So this is just some of the base functionality in SAM Pro. And having all this information in an easy to get location can make audits, like we mentioned earlier, a lot more painless. So with a little customization, the sky really is the limit for what SAM Pro can offer. And to discuss that further, I'm going to let Will talk about what we did for ONEOK.
Thanks, Shane. As mentioned, I was the primary implementation specialist for ONEOK, and we were able to deploy a fairly unique solution that covers the whole life cycle of software asset management. Software Asset Management Professional, the plugin in ServiceNow, contains a lot of functionality, but there are some additional things that will really make that entire process come together. On the left side, we talk a little bit here about the SAM implementation that we did, and a lot of that is the baseline implementation that you get from many partners. Configuring the Software Asset Management Professional plugin, making sure that the publisher packs are enabled and configured correctly, setting up the integration with the Microsoft SCCM system to pull in the software installation data and usage data. Pretty standard steps for most implementations. But additionally, we configured the client software delivery, I always mess that one up, which allows us to work with SCCM and push and pull software from people's machines. We also configured the contracts module to allow them to track their contracts as they're associated with the software, whether that's a maintenance contract or some sort of additional agreement that goes along with that software. And all of that's part of a fairly base SAMP implementation. But we wanted to go a little bit beyond that and give them some automation functionality that would help save some time. So we implemented reusable catalog workflows that are easy for the software asset manager to configure and gave that standardized process for people who are requesting software. We also set up an integration with their Active Directory because they use Active Directory to control and list some of the software accesses that were already in their environment. We also integrated with their purchase order system so that licenses can be procured automatically as the user is requesting those items, and there may not be licenses available. Additionally, we created a license renewal workflow that automates a lot of the tasks that the software asset management team was working on to do those renewals, saving them steps that they would have to do in multiple different records across the system. Of course, we addressed the entitlements and allocations as well by performing the bulk load that Shane was talking about. In addition, we created some custom functionality for bulk loading their allocations, something that was missing from the baseline platform in ServiceNow. Also, there was a subscription table. For those of you who are familiar with ServiceNow, two different ways of measuring our software usage, the subscriptions or the installations. And if we don't have an API for the subscription data, it was difficult to track how the subscriptions were actually being used. So we created the subscription records from those catalog items so that we could track those subscription softwares that don't have the API. And I have an asterisk here for you, for those of you who have upgraded to the newest version and are in Orlando. That's actually no longer a necessary step because they've allowed you to create allocations for subscription products, whereas before that wasn't a capability. So all of this really kind of comes together to fill in that whole life cycle picture of software asset management. Starting at the top, looking at our request phase of the life cycle, We implemented a self-service software catalog, which you've probably seen in different demonstrations. But one thing that was really unique is that we also needed to include SOX compliant approvals. If you have worked with SOX regulations, you understand how difficult it can be to make sure that you're meeting the appropriate levels of separation of duty and all of the different requirements around SOX and recording what's necessary for that. And so we made sure that their request process included those particular requirements for those regulations. On the fulfillment side, we put in automation that would allow us to trigger the procurement process when we determined that there were no licenses available to assign out to the user. So when a user requests an item, it does a check to see not only what do we have purchased and what do we have allocated, but also what do we have installed on people's computers. We want to make sure that we're never going over what we've purchased so that we're not exposing ourselves to potential risk. And so the process that we built for them considers all of those different factors and data points when making a decision about whether to move into the procurement process. In addition, we set up dynamic generation of the fulfillment tasks and notifications so that all of the teams who work with the software asset management process, both inside ServiceNow and outside ServiceNow, could remain connected about the process and know what steps they needed to take next. In the deployment phase of the lifecycle, we'd have the integration with Active Directory, and that Active Directory setup also triggers their SCCM. And that SCCM, of course, delivering software. And in some cases, we're also granting access to applications based on the integrations that were in place for their Active Directory. One of my favorite features that we implemented for them as well is to educate the requester after their request has been fulfilled. We will send them an automated email that includes applicable knowledge, next steps, or anything that they may need to know. That gets predefined by the software manager and automatically sent out as the user moves through the process of requesting their software. In the reconciliation phase, we're again trying to save steps, trying to save time, and really make it a simple process for both the people who are fulfilling and the people who are requesting. So our automation creates the needed entitlements, allocations, and contract records that are going to be necessary from these previous steps. After we've triggered procurement, we need to make sure that we're recording all the financial data and the number of licenses and the type of licenses. We tie that into the original request so we know which requested item it came from, who was the requester, and we can create the allocation out to that specific requester. And then we have the traceability all the way through of where did this originate, who approved it, where was it fulfilled, what was the dollar amount, and that whole visibility is really providing a great value. Moving into the service section of our life cycle, we establish reclamation rules to manage that software harvesting. And those reclamation rules are fairly baseline functionality within ServiceNow, but we identified that it's really important not to uninstall software from people who are VIP level that may need software or may not use it in the same manner as other employees. And so we actually added to the ServiceNow baseline configuration to build in exceptions for certain roles or certain people so that we're not causing any issues with those VIPs. And then of course we use automation to assist with those enterprise software and contract renewals. Really something that is normally more of a manual process, opening up the records, changing the dates, creating new records, migrating between the different records. We wanted to save some time there, and so we automated those steps as well. Let me move into the retirement phase and talk a little bit about what we were able to implement there as well. One thing that we wanted to do is identify the terminated employees to make sure that we are managing the records for them as well. One thing that we see a lot is employees will leave the company or move on to different roles in the company, and it can take some time for the desktop teams to be able to clear out the computer, to perform the reformat, and sometimes those records sit and wait. Even though they're not being used and the user doesn't have access to that software, the system still has the record that says that they have access to it. So we identified their existing retirement workflow, and we were able to piggyback onto that workflow and use that to update the records for those user computers and the software that was installed to make sure that that inventory and that deployment record is always correct and always trued up to what is actually in the environment. We also are managing the software models to identify the software that's past its life cycle. ONEOK was very conscientious about the versioning of the software that they're using and making sure that users have the appropriate version, and they can use now the life cycle, both what's provided by the publisher of the software and their internal life cycles, to make sure that they are aligning to what needs to happen with the different versions. So all of this together, one big picture, was able to really set the ONEOK software managers free to really deliver the service instead of worrying about the daily operations. So for those of you, again, familiar with the platform, you're aware that the software model is really the heart of software asset management. And using some of the automation within the platform and some manual pieces to manage the software, they were able to create just over 2,000 software models that are managed within their environment. So those could be subscription-based software, engineering-based software, installed software, but over 2,000 models now that they're able to manage with software asset management. Using those models, they then move into that catalog request where they can have people come in and request the titles that they're looking for. So they have a 48-item checklist for those catalog items when building them to make sure that they're complete and ready for the automation and ready for the delivery to the end user. So things like making sure that there are entitlements, making sure that there are allocations, making sure that all of the relevant fields are filled out, the knowledge articles, the deployment groups, getting all of those pieces together has now become a regular checklist for them that they can go through and make sure that everything's ready to go into those catalog items. They've built 34 active catalog items, which allow them to completely automate this life cycle. So somebody can go in and request it and not have to have the software asset manager going in and touching each request and validating each request and manually moving it through each of these phases for each of these 34 catalog items. And they did this in a couple different phases. We had our initial deployment and spent about 6 months doing our initial configurations and loading all of those different pieces and making sure everything looked good and reconciliation was working. And then took on additional phases with additional business partners and finding those organizations and products that were high volume or high impact or high dollar amount that were really going to save the company time and effort. And because of that, they've now had over 1,200 requests go through this process that, again, they're not having to touch manually. They're not having to review every single time they go through. And that's allowed them to get an average close time now of 4 hours, which, if you understand the complete life cycle of the software, you're probably a little bit surprised by that short amount of time. That's from when the user requests it to when it's been delivered to the user on their desktop, often being pushed directly to their computer. They're ready to go. And that process sometimes could take days and weeks to complete because of all of the approvals and the steps and having to call procurement and going through all of those processes that used to be manual. They used to have a much higher time, and now they've been able to expedite it and basically a completely automated process in that 4 hours, accepting, of course, your approvals and things like that. They've also used the automation that we built to do 21 software renewals. And if you've been through a software renewal, those are very cumbersome, often having to go through the contracts and identify, is this the right license type? Do we have the right number? Are we increasing our counts or decreasing our counts? Are we going to change the licensing type to maybe get a better deal or a better value? And so the automated catalog process that we built for their software asset manager allows them to go in and specify some of those details and let the system do all of the back-end work that's necessary for those renewals. So Sarah can go in and attach her quote and fill in the details of what she needs changed. I'm going to need a total of 1,200 licenses, and I need these license metrics, and I'm going to extend my existing contract, and the system will automatically go in and do all of those steps for her. And again, taking the time for her to deliver that service, really reducing it so that she can focus on more of her daily operations and less of the the system, data input type of activities that she was doing before. We talked a little bit as well about the reclamation candidates and how the system is able to identify low usage software and using their rules, which the most common rule that they use is a 90-day. We are generating those records and then using those about 149 reclamation candidates now, the installations that aren't being used, they have recovered about $120,000 in unused licenses. So just setting up the system and configuring it to their particular requirements, really a cost avoidance there and a reclamation of $120,000, which is, I think, a pretty great return on investment for them. But it's not always perfect. There's a lot of lessons that need to be learned. There are always challenges that need to be faced when doing any sort of a deployment, any sort of automation. And ONEOK had some great lessons learned. We had some growing experiences and wanted to share these with you in hopes that these would help you in any of your software projects. So if you've been around ServiceNow for very long, you'll know that ServiceNow's software asset management has really grown over the last couple of years. So when you implement it, it can pose some challenges depending on your current environment. One of the things that we discovered was the dependency on discovery. A lot of people don't know that for some software products, particularly things like SQL or Citrix, some of those more complicated enterprise type products really require discovery. They're not like your desktop software where you can just get a list of everything that's installed and you can just count those installations and everything goes well. We identified that discovery was necessary, and even though ONEOK had been using discovery, we had not identified that they were using the probes, which are the old version of discovery. And software asset management is very heavily dependent on you using the most current version of discovery, which is patterns. So as we moved through the process, we identified that they didn't have those patterns running, and we had to engage with ServiceNow and bring in some of the specialists at GlideFast to migrate them from the probes to the patterns to make sure that the count, the consumption, the dashboards, all of those pieces that are dependent on discovery for certain products were really in place and ready to go. So Sarah, if you want to go ahead and pick it up from here, I covered number one.
Perfect. So we will jump into number two. So part of the implementation that we had, as what a draw for SAM Pro was for me, is the ability of the publisher packs and the API functionality. So we were able to pull those subscriptions into our SAM Pro instance. And as we were trying to create all of our entitlements and licensing for our Adobe products, we found out that the API from our Creative Cloud portal would not pull all of our subscription users back into SAM Pro. And after working with GlideFast, partnering with ServiceNow, we found out that Adobe actually has a process where you have to have an enterprise level account in order to utilize the API. We just had a CLP level, and so the API would never work. So we were able to identify and help ServiceNow add some additional documentation that the licensing tier and the licensing that you might have with a particular vendor could affect these APIs that ServiceNow has set up. So they have the ability, but depending on what you're actually entitled to, may limit if you could use that API functionality. A third thing that I wanted to highlight as a lessons learned is there are several license metrics types that are not available in SAM Pro currently. So the days of per device and per user are slowly dwindling. And we have, with our company being within the midstream gas company, we have a lot of engineering applications that have concurrent licensing. And so out of the box, SAM Pro does not have a license metric for concurrent. We have some applications that are licensed per work permit. And so those are not drop-down items that I can select when I want to create an entitlement, and I want to make that entitlement of what we're actually licensed for. And so we had to partner with GlideFast again and create some custom license metrics. But I just wanted to point this out as all of your entitlements may not match exactly. And so I've reached back out to ServiceNow. I've asked for different licensing metric types to be added in future releases. And then we've had to create some custom ones. So just a point of caution as you guys are implementing or thinking about implementing SAM Pro.
And Sarah, I would just add to that, there's been a recent release with ServiceNow where they actually have an engineering license manager that works with OpenLM. So some of those engineering applications that previously weren't supported, and partly thanks to feedback from clients like you, ServiceNow is able to add in very similar to like a publisher pack functionality, where now they're starting to be able to measure those types of things, the concurrent licenses and network licenses and things. So it's really important that not only ServiceNow gets your feedback as you're working through these license metric issues, but that you keep up to date and that you have a partner who understands the changes that are coming to help make sure that you're aligning to those different license metrics.
Absolutely. So number 4, contracts and renewals. So as Will alluded to in the beginning, contracts were an important piece for me. So this is what I use to track maintenance renewals. I use that to look at our spend year over year. Are they increasing per our contract? Is maintenance gone down? And so really like to just look at those year over year as we're doing our renewals. So as part of SAM Pro, the contracts module had to be configured as well. And so a big piece that I wanted GlideFast to help us with is that I can process a renewal through appropriate workflows. So if I'm changing license types, or if it's a subscription versus a perpetual renewal, I wanted to create a workflow that I could put those in that would flow to our procurement team, that would then update my entitlements, as well as create a new contract for me to manage throughout that year of that renewal. And so that is not a baseline functionality of SAM Pro. And so that is, contracts module does have to be configured. And then we did have to build that specific workflow for my renewals. And you might have simple renewals where it's just you're renewing the same license again, price did not change, or you're gonna have your more complex. We might be a per user license and we need to move to concurrent. So they built that workflow to handle those different types of situations. So just wanted to highlight that that's not something out of the box, but that it can be created in working with an implementation partner. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight the kind of your continued growth as you go through SAM Pro. So we implemented SAM Pro with the London instance, and we've since upgraded to New York. And so I just wanted to highlight and encourage anybody that's out there thinking about implementing SAM Pro or software management platform, that you partner with ServiceNow, you partner with an implementation partner to help with those upgrades. So we found out that as SAM Pro advances, and they're constantly making updates, because it was a fairly new product, it's only a couple of years old, and feedback that we're giving them, they're putting those fixes into the releases. And so a lot of the configurations that GlideFast even helped us with when we implemented last year, those changes have already been taken into account in the new release of New York that we're in. And so some of the functionality and some of the configurations we've had to go back and kind of revert and adjust. And so really looking at those upgrade plans, those maps, the enhancements, what's coming out, and partnering with ServiceNow if any help is needed to do those upgrades and perform them, as well as GlideFast or an implementation partner of your choice to help kind of note what did we have to do after this upgrade, what testing do we need to do for the next one, and then really lean on them and leverage them to help get through those updates, because they're going to add continued functionality. And something that you may have had to configure a certain way because that functionality wasn't available, it could be available in the next release. And so really just want to highlight that you're partnering with your implementation partner, you're documenting and you're understanding what new functionality is there so you guys can have the best experience during an upgrade.
Absolutely, Sarah. And I would just add to that, it's important the partner that you pick. Not all partners are created equal. So getting somebody that's an elite partner that's tied in lockstep with ServiceNow. I can tell you personally, I've had me ServiceNow to review the roadmaps to make sure that our customers are prepared so that we know the functionality is coming and can prepare our customers for it. Really important to find the partner that's really tuned in to software and what's coming down the road.
Absolutely.
And point 5 leads us perfectly into Sam Pro's never-ending story. I think one of the main points that we wanted to get across with this is that your software asset management process should not end after implementation. I mean, your organization's requirements are always changing. You'll have different software, different vendors, and so on. So what you've implemented 2 years ago, or even maybe even 2 weeks ago, may not be what you need right this moment. So a lot of that can be involved in handling new software or new vendors, or you have new departments that pop up within your organization, new business requirements. And so as these items come up, so new software, for example, if a new piece of software comes in, you have to handle, you have to create the model itself. You have to handle discovery of the installation, entitlements, allocations of it, product updates. And then also on the vendor side of things, some vendors allow capabilities to tie into the system and add allocations and entitlements from their end. And so as you change vendors, these things might come up as well. And so reevaluation is key throughout this whole process, and not just from the technology side of things, but also within your organization. Your department heads or your application owners more than likely will know more about the software and their usage of the software than the software asset manager will. And so a good plan is to have ongoing meetings to evaluate this software with these key players. And going along with that, they can also help you understand the license utilization and how they have split things apart for on-prem and cloud. And so pulling in the right people into these meetings and having these ongoing evaluations play a big role in a clean software asset management process. And so throughout this whole process of gathering usage information, reconciling licensing, updating policies and procedures, you can work out with your organization to achieve a successful software asset management process. So I'm going to end us there.
Awesome. And it looks like it's time to dive into some of the questions that are coming through. So we could start off with this one. What are SOX applications and how do they differ from regular applications?
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to answer that one for us since you're most familiar with that?
SOX applications are a set of applications, Sarbanes-Oxley. So really they're around financial applications, and they are held to a more regulated and under a microscope. So you have to be in compliance. Not only do we have internal audit that looks at that, but we have external companies that have to make sure that we understand who has access to that application, that the approver is also not the person that granted that access to that application. And then we have quarterly attestation. So we're going through, we're making sure that everybody that has access was approved. If somebody has left the company, we're pulling back that information. We're making sure we're updating those roles, and just to maintain that strict compliance with those financial type applications.
Awesome. Here's another one that came through. When you migrate from one entitlement to a renewed entitlement, is there a way to move the allocations too?
I'm glad that you asked that. I get that question quite a lot, and it's something that we were able to build for Sarah and the ONEOK team, but unfortunately is not available in the baseline platform. If you're familiar with the structure in ServiceNow, the entitlement being the record of what you've purchased from your vendor that the company has a right to use. And then the allocation is the internal distribution of that license, which users or which computers are supposed to have that software. And when you move from one entitlement to another, in the case of a new entitlement, or those allocations are still tied to your original entitlement. And there's not an automated way where you can just press a button to say, move all of these allocations over to my new renewed entitlement. So that's a process that we had to work on and add a customization that we did in the ONEOK instance that I think has been really beneficial to Sarah and looking at the, how much time it was taking her to do those individual allocations. So no, the answer to that question is no, there's not a built-in way to do that, but with a little bit of development, it's something that you could easily accomplish.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it's absolutely saving a lot of time on my end.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Awesome. We just had another one come in. When harvesting software, is it SCCM that removes the software, or is it ServiceNow?
Some of these questions make me laugh, and I'm sure Sarah's chuckling a little bit too, because this is one of the misconceptions that we deal with a lot in software asset management. The orchestration capability in ServiceNow, often people look at that as the ability to uninstall software. I can send a command to a device and have it perform a software uninstall, but that's not really the design behind software asset management. It does use the SCCM integration, and more specifically, it's the CSD, the client software delivery integration, that allows you to add users to collections in SCCM, remove users from collections in SCCM, and that's the best way to do this. So ServiceNow does not want to be the platform that is performing those software actions. There are specific tools. SCCM is the tool that is purpose-built to manage software on Windows devices. So ServiceNow just wants to work with that application and trigger those actions to happen in those external systems, not be the system that's doing it itself. You can imagine the security concerns that would happen if ServiceNow, as a cloud-based platform, can execute code on a Windows desktop anywhere in your environment. So again, short answer to that question, summing it up, ServiceNow triggers SCCM to perform the software installs and uninstalls, but is not doing the actual steps in the platform.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. It looks like we have 2 more questions. What's a typical next step or phase after the initial implementation?
Sarah, do you want to talk to us a little bit about your evolution? I talked a little bit about how we started back in January 2019 and spent about 6 months getting the initial setup configuration done. Do you want to talk a little bit about what happened after that?
Yeah, thank you. So we initially started with the 5 publisher packs that Will talked about at the beginning. So we really wanted to dig into those, list all of those entitlements. And that was kind of our phase 1. So we had built out all of our entitlements for those top 5 publishers. Some of those did have outward-facing catalog items that users could go through and benefit from the SAM Pro workflow. But some of those are just internal. They would never be a user-facing application. So next steps is starting to look at and building out your software models, which is basically your catalog and your portfolio of what software your company owns. And then you really start at different phases. Our second phase, we looked at those SOX applications and we started to tackle those. So the same way that we did the top 5 publishers, you're going to gather the information, you're going to build your software models, you're going to use your checklist, you're going to partner with the application owners to create the catalog item, and then you're going to apply that workflow. So that was phase 2. We worked on the SOX applications. And so now we're moving on and we're looking at what are some of the highly requested desktop type applications. Do we need to look at the next group of maybe our gas measurement and what set of applications do they use? And so I know that you guys have heard time and again, start slow, start with, a handful of publishers. And so that's what we did. We tackled the top 5 publisher packs, then we moved on to SOX. And so now we're looking at those highly utilized applications. Some people may look at spend. And so you really just have to start the process over again. So you're going to build out your model, you're going to build out your catalog items, you're going to apply your workflow, you're going to do your contracts. And so you just kind of repeat that process over and over. And as you start to build out those catalog items and that automated workflow, your ticket load that you had previously will start to decrease. And so you can, spend more time in the tool and feeding the tool, adding those models in, adding that contract information, and then continuing to build out that software portfolio.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Looks like we have one more question that we can get to. Do you have to use the contracts module to track your maintenance dates?
I'm glad you asked that question. There has been some changes in ServiceNow recently, even from when we were implementing with Sarah. And one of those things is that on the actual entitlement itself now, they're able to track maintenance as its own dates and its own information, not as a separate record. And there are some benefits of doing it different ways, but I'll just say before I hand over to Sarah a little bit, you can do some maintenance tracking on the entitlement itself, particularly with the perpetual plus maintenance metric or some of the other Microsoft type metrics. But it really doesn't give you the same kind of full picture as you do when you use the contracts module. Sarah, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the subscription entitlement, you do have the ability to list, here's my start date and my end date. And then the same thing that Will mentioned for the perpetual with the maintenance. So here's my maintenance date from here to here. But that is inside of the software model, inside the entitlement record. So that's a couple layers down. I like the benefit of using the contracts module just because I could easily filter for a particular application and it will pull all of those records up for me. So it'll show year after year, it'll show me my dates, it'll show me my spend so I can see if it's increasing or if I decrease because maybe I dropped some licenses off. So the contract module just gives me an easy, quick view. You're still adding those dates and those timeframes and the cost on the entitlement, but with the contracts, it's just a quick, easy view, and then you link the two together.
And the automation that we built for Sarah, those things automatically on the back end, I think has been a real time saver and still allows you to have that rich data, really just kind of that extra step beyond just tracking your basic dates and your basic information. And even though the ONEOK team has a separate repository for contracts, the actual terms and conditions and the executed, PDFs and signatures and all of that, this just allows Sarah to have the visibility in ServiceNow of those longer arching contracts, right? I mean, they cover multiple years, multiple renewals, multiple entitlements. There may be terms or dollar amounts or things that change that are more difficult to do just on the entitlement. So I think having those things together and bringing them into one system is really added to what ONEOK is able to do.
Yeah, it's really cut down a lot of my documentation time that I had previously. So I can issue a renewal through the renewal workflow now, and it's going to automatically create my new entitlement. It's going to automatically create my contract with those start and end dates, the cost, the purchase order, the request item, where I was manually doing all of that before. So that workflow has been a great time saver, and it helps keep everything documented.
Well, it looks like that's all the time we have for questions today. So now I'd like to move on and announce the winner of our $50 Visa gift card giveaway. And it looks like the winner is Jane Young. Congratulations. We'll be emailing your prize to you directly after this webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We hope you found it super insightful, and feel free to reach out to the GlideFast team or Will or Shane. Their emails are their first.last name @glidefast.com. And I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Sarah Butler from ONEOK for being a guest speaker on today's webinar. It was awesome hearing your experience through your SAM Pro implementation. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you on future webinars.